Hashtag congratulations, you've just declared war on the deadliest species in the galaxy. The signal came in at 3:14 in the morning, Earth Standard Time. Nobody was ready for it. Nobody is ever ready for anything at 3:14 in the morning. Dr. Nora Blaine was the one who caught it first. She was at the Jupiter listening post, sitting in a chair that had been uncomfortable since the day it was bolted to the floor, drinking coffee that had stopped being hot an hour ago. She almost missed it. The signal was clean, structured, formatted in a galactic diplomatic frequency that the post had been calibrated to detect but never actually expected to receive. She read it once. Then she laughed. Not a small laugh. The kind that starts somewhere deep and takes over your whole body. The kind that makes your eyes water and your chair creak because you're shaking. The official log for Listening Post 7 would later record, in dry technical language, that Dr. Blaine experienced an extended vocal response lasting approximately 45 seconds before she composed herself enough to flag the transmission for Earth Defense Command. The document was 63 pages long. It was notarized. It had a seal, a counterseal, and a reference number that suggested it had been filed in triplicate somewhere across the galaxy before it ever reached her desk. It was a declaration of war. A formal, legal, Galactic Covenant-certified declaration of war against the human species, delivered with all the bureaucratic dignity of a utility bill. Attached to it was a pamphlet. Glossy, in the metaphorical sense, the Verdani equivalent of glossy. It was titled, in translation, What Comes Next? Your Guide to Post-Conquest Integration. It had a helpful section on resource redistribution. It had a FAQ page. Nora wiped her eyes, took a breath, and sent the whole thing to Admiral Grace Okafor. Grace Okafor received the transmission at 4:02 a.m. She read all 63 pages. Then she read the pamphlet. She set the pamphlet face down on her desk, very carefully, very precisely, the way a person sets something down when they do not want to look at it anymore. Then she picked up her comm and called an emergency session of Earth Defense Command. Her voice, when she spoke, was the same temperature it always was. Not cold. Just level. The kind of level that doesn't move regardless of what's happening around it. The session was running by 5:30. 14 people in a room that smelled like recycled air and old coffee. Nobody had slept. The declaration was on every screen. Grace stood at the head of the table and did not use a single unnecessary word. The Verdani Collective, she explained, had given Earth a 72-hour window to respond with unconditional surrender. They had conquered 47 civilizations. They had a process. A timeline. A pamphlet. Someone at the table, a young logistics officer named Pete Garza, who would later describe this moment to his grandchildren, raised his hand and asked if the FAQ was real. Grace looked at him. Yes. Pete Garza nodded slowly. Okay, he said. That was all. The declaration leaked to the public by 10 a.m. No one was ever sure how. It was everywhere, every feed, every screen, every device. People read it on their morning commute. They read it over breakfast. They sent it to each other with one-word responses, most of which were not printable in diplomatic documentation. The reaction was not fear. That surprised the Verdani, later, when they reviewed the social data they had collected. 11 years ago, fear might have been the right call. 11 years ago the planet was still pulling itself out of the Third World War, still clearing rubble, still counting names, still arguing about who owed what to whom in the long brutal math of aftermath. Fear would have made sense then. But that was 11 years ago. And the people reading this declaration were not the same people who had watched cities disappear. They were the people who had rebuilt what was left. They were annoyed. They were fired up. And a significant number of them were, in a hard-edged, teeth-showing sort of way, entertained by the idea that something out there thought 63 pages and a pamphlet was going to do the job. The social response was logged. Filed. Sent to Verdani Intelligence. Fleet Commander Uxrel read the summary and noted in his personal log that the humans appeared to be reacting with irrational emotional aggression rather than rational fear. He concluded they had failed to understand the document. He decided to proceed. Captain Lou Hartley got the alert at 6:47 a.m., while the ERS Iron Patience was still in dry dock above the moon, 3 weeks from finishing a refit that was supposed to take 2. He was eating a biscuit. He read the alert on his comm, finished the biscuit, then walked out onto the dock platform and looked at his ship, half its plating still open, conduit bundles hanging out of the hull like loose thread. He went back inside and found his chief engineer, a woman named Bev Kowalski, who communicated primarily through sighs and hand gestures, and told her the timeline had changed. Bev looked at him. She looked at the ship. She made a sound that was not quite a word. 3 days, Lou said. Another sound. Also not a word. 2.5, Lou said. We'll figure out the rest while we move. He gathered his crew at 0800. 51 people in a half-finished bay, standing on a deck that still had construction tape on it. He didn't give a speech. Lou Hartley did not give speeches. He told them what was happening, what the timeline was, and what he needed from each of them. Then he said, I don't know what's out there or how bad it's going to get. But I know this crew. So let's go find out. They got back to work. Earth's formal reply to the Verdani Declaration was drafted by a team of 12 diplomats, reviewed by Grace Okafor, and transmitted at 71 hours and 58 minutes, 2 minutes before the deadline. The Verdani had sent 63 pages. Earth sent back 4 words. We don't do surrender. Uxrel received the reply at the 2-minute mark. He stared at it for a long time. His communications officer waited. His tactical officer waited. The bridge of the Verdani flagship was very quiet. He pulled up the human civilization file on his display. 60 years of spaceflight. 1 planet. 17 functional warships. A species that had only recently stopped tearing itself apart long enough to look at the stars. He closed the file. Begin advance, he said. It did not occur to him, in that moment, that 60 years of spaceflight was not the same thing as 60 years of learning how to fight. It did not occur to him that the species he was looking at had been doing that second thing, the fighting, for a length of time that his civilization's entire recorded history didn't come close to matching. He saw a young species. He saw a small fleet. He saw a planet that had only just learned to reach beyond its own gravity well. He did not see what was underneath that. Most people never do, until it's too late to matter. Back on the Iron Patience, Lou Hartley stood at the front viewport and watched the moon getting smaller behind them. His ship groaned in 2 or 3 places it probably shouldn't have groaned. Danny Corso, his weapons officer, was at the console running numbers on what was working and what wasn't, and making a face that suggested the numbers were having a conversation he didn't love. How are we looking? Lou asked. Danny considered this for a moment. We're looking like a ship that left dry dock 2.5 weeks early. But we're moving. We're moving, Danny confirmed. Lou nodded. That was enough. For now, that was exactly enough. The Iron Patience moved out into the dark, trailing loose cable from 2 of her portside panels, her crew working on 3 hours of sleep in a war that nobody asked for and everybody was already tired of losing before it had even started. Somewhere behind them, Earth watched the stars and waited. Somewhere ahead, 42 Verdani warships were running their checklists. Filling in their forms. Following their procedure. They had done this 47 times before. They were very good at it. They were about to learn that 47 was not enough. #congratulations, you've just declared war on the deadliest species in the galaxy. The Verdani fleet came in clean. 42 ships in perfect formation, moving like something that had done this many times and saw no reason to be nervous. Because they had. And they weren't. Fleet Commander Uxrel watched the approach on his tactical display with the calm of a man checking a box. The humans had 17 ships. His fleet had 42. The math was, as math goes, not complicated. He had run this exact scenario 11 times in simulation before departure. Every simulation ended the same way, within a margin of error so small it was essentially 0. He expected the human fleet to scatter on first contact. Most species did. It was not cowardice. It was sense. When something that large came toward you and you had that many fewer ships, you broke formation and tried to run. A few of the braver ones tried to stall while evacuation began. One species, a long time ago, had actually charged. They had gone down fast, but they had gone down swinging, and Uxrel had noted it in his log as a curiosity before moving on. He was expecting something in that range. Scattering, or a slow retreat, or perhaps a desperate charge. The human fleet did none of those things. It held position. 17 ships in a tight cluster, not moving, sitting in the dark between Earth and the approaching Verdani line. Just waiting. Uxral frowned at the display. Are their engines functioning? Yes, sir, his tactical officer said. Full thrust capability. They're choosing not to move. He thought about that. Run the suppression volley. The Verdani's standard opening move was a suppression volley, a wide spread of concussive fire designed to shatter an enemy formation and push any survivors into scattered retreat. It was not meant to destroy all 17 ships. It was meant to break them apart so they could be picked off one by one. It worked. It had always worked. It worked because no ship's commander, when shells were filling the space in every direction, made the choice to stay in formation. The volley launched. It was massive and loud in the way that space is loud, which is to say completely silent but visible on every sensor as a wall of devastation closing on the human cluster at speed. The humans drove straight into it. Not to fight it. Not through some act of desperate bravery. Lou Hartley's voice came over the iron Patience's comm at that moment, flat and calm, telling Danny Corso to fire the portside thrusters at full burn on his mark, angle 32 degrees into the incoming wave. Danny did it. So did every other ship in the human formation, on cue, all 17 of them hitting their thrusters in coordinated angles that turned the incoming shockwave from the volley into something else entirely. A slingshot. The concussive force hit the human fleet and instead of scattering them it accelerated them, all 17 ships using the blast wave as a launch ramp, riding it forward and splitting into 3 tight groups that came through the back end of the volley moving faster than anything Uxral's tactical display had anticipated. The bridge of the Verdani flagship went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with professionalism. What was that? Uxral said. Nobody answered. Because nobody had a word for it. What followed was 38 minutes that Uxral would later describe in his log as operationally irregular. The humans did not fight the way the simulations said they would fight. The simulations assumed an enemy that tried to minimize losses and preserve ships. The humans seemed to be working from a different model entirely, one where the goal was not to survive the engagement cleanly but to make the engagement cost as much as possible, regardless of what it cost them in return. They went after the big ships first. Not the obvious targets, not the weakest hulls, the biggest. The anchors of the Verdani formation. 2 of them went down in the first 12 minutes. Not destroyed, but crippled, leaking drive plasma, knocked out of formation and drifting. Without those anchors the Verdani flanking pattern broke down. Uxral ordered a reform. The humans were already moving before he finished the order. Danny Corso had not slept in 31 hours. He was running his targeting off a hybrid system. Half the ship's fire control was still in pieces from the drydock refit, and the half that was working in a way that Bev Kowalski described as enthusiastically held together. Danny was doing the targeting math on a physical notepad because his secondary display had gone dark 11 minutes into the engagement, and he had not mentioned this to anyone because there was no one he could mention it to who wasn't already doing 3 other things at once. His math was good. He had always been good at math. Growing up outside Scranton he had not had much else to do some winters but sit inside and work numbers, and he had brought that same focused, slightly grim energy to the weapons console of a ship in its first real battle. 2 degrees north, he said to himself, adjusted, and fired. The Verdani cruiser on the display cracked along its midsection and stopped moving. Lou Hartley saw it on his screen. Did not say anything. Got back to work. The battle lasted 38 minutes. When it was over, the human fleet had lost 4 ships. 4 out of 17. The names of those ships would be read aloud that evening in a broadcast back on Earth. The names of the people on them would be read too, one by one, because Grace Okafor had given that order before the engagement even started. She had known there would be names to read. She had wanted them read right. The Verdani had lost 9 ships destroyed and 7 more crippled or disabled. With 42 ships against 17, they had come into the engagement expecting a margin of error close to 0. They retreated to regroup. Uxral sat in his command chair for a long time after the order was given. His tactical officer pulled up the numbers and put them on the main display. His communications officer waited. His bridge crew waited. He read the numbers twice. Then he opened his personal log and wrote, "They fight as though losing is a temporary condition." He stared at that sentence. It was the most accurate thing he could find to say. He had no framework for an enemy that absorbed losses and kept calculating. His war simulations modeled fear, desperation, and rational self-preservation. They did not model whatever this was. Whatever this was, it did not have a name in his language. He closed the log and started working on a request for reinforcements. Back on Earth, in the Earth Defense Command operations room, Grace Okafor stood in front of a screen showing the engagement data. Her staff was around her, some of them relieved, a couple of them trying not to show how relieved they were. They had won the engagement. It was something. It was real. Grace was looking at the 4 ships. The ones that weren't coming back. She stood there for a long time. Nobody talked. Nobody rushed her. Then she turned to her intelligence officer, a woman named Clara Mendez who had been awake for 22 hours and looked at, and said, "Get me everything we have on Verdani fleet resupply patterns. Supply chains, fuel lines, maintenance schedules. All of it." Clara nodded and got to work. Grace turned back to the screen. The battle data was still there. The 4 ships were still gone. The math had not changed. She looked at it without flinching, the way a person looks at a thing they have already decided they are going to solve, no matter how long it takes or how bad it gets. On the Iron Patience, now running back toward Earth on reduced power, Danny Corso fell asleep in his chair at the weapons console. The notepad was still in his hand. Someone, Bev Kowalski, though she would deny it, put a blanket over him and turned the overhead lights down. Nobody woke him for 4 hours. He needed it. They all needed it. Because the Verdani were coming back, and they were not going to come back smaller. But that was 4 hours from now. For 4 hours, the Iron Patience drifted through the quiet dark, and the crew that was awake moved carefully around the one who wasn't, and somewhere far behind them the fleet that had not expected any of this was trying to figure out what came next. They were good at procedures. At timelines. At checklists. What they were not good at was this. What they had never had to be good at before was this, #congratulations, you've just declared war on the deadliest species in the galaxy. The Verdani did not come back smaller. They came back with 81 ships and something that made 81 ships look like the minor part of the problem. The Worldbreaker platform dropped out of warp at the edge of the solar system 3 weeks after the first engagement, and every long-range sensor array humanity had pointed at that region of space lit up like a city from above. The platform was not a ship. Calling it a ship was like calling an ocean a puddle, technically in the same category but embarrassingly wrong about the scale. It was 2 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. It had cracked the crust of a planet before. Not damaged. Not bombed. Cracked. The way you crack an egg, if the egg was a world and 12 billion things were living inside it. The Verdani broadcast its arrival openly, on every frequency they could reach. This was intentional. Uxral had studied what had happened in the first engagement. His ships had lost badly. He could explain that, the humans had fought in a way nobody expected, and surprise accounted for a significant portion of the damage. He had asked for reinforcements. He had the numbers now. But he had also requested the Worldbreaker because he had decided that the problem with the first engagement was not tactics. The problem was that the humans did not believe they were going to lose. The Worldbreaker was meant to fix that. On Earth, it worked. Sort of. People gathered in city squares and parks and on rooftops to watch the long-range feeds from the sensor buoys near the system's edge. The platform was there on every screen, enormous and still and patient, the way a very large thing can afford to be patient. Some people cried. Some people went home. Some people stayed, standing in the dark, watching it and not saying anything. But they did not panic. That part, the Verdani plan for mass panic, for a civilian population demanding surrender, that part did not work. Because the people standing on those rooftops had grown up in the rubble of a world war. They knew what it looked like when something massive was coming for you. They had stood in that place before. And they were still here. They were angry. Specifically and precisely angry, in the way people get when something they worked very hard to keep alive is being threatened again. Lou Hartley watched the feed from the bridge of the Iron Patience, which was back in dry dock, the fast version of dry dock, the kind Bev Kowalski described as aggressive repair, getting the damage from the first engagement fixed. He looked at the world breaker on his screen for about 15 seconds. Then he looked at Danny Corso, who was eating a sandwich at his console and also looking at it. "That's a big ship," Lou said. Danny chewed. Swallowed. "Yep. What do we do with big ships?" Danny thought about it. "Not long. Find the dumb part." Lou nodded. They both looked at the platform a little longer. Then they both got back to work. In a small, overcrowded office in the Linguistics Division of Earth Defense Command, Dr. Nora Blaine had been awake for what she estimated was a morally unreasonable number of hours. She was surrounded by Verdani communication logs, everything intercepted since first contact, every transmission, every data packet, every diplomatic exchange. She had been looking for something. A pattern. A gap. She found it at 2 a.m. On a Tuesday, sitting under a light that kept flickering because nobody had fixed the wiring in that office in 3 years. The Verdani did not have a word for attrition. She checked this 3 ways because she did not trust herself that tired. She searched every word in their recorded vocabulary, every phrase, every military term. There was nothing. No word for a war that was fought slowly, painfully, inch by inch, bleeding both sides until one of them ran out of something vital. No concept for an enemy that accepted the grinding, punishing, endless math of outlasting instead of outfighting. Every species the Verdani had conquered had done one of 2 things, tried to win decisively, or surrendered. Every engagement in their military history followed the same shape, fast and hard, or over before it dragged. They had never fought something that was willing to keep losing, in small and calculated ways, for as long as it took. Nora stared at her screen. Her flickering light buzzed. She thought about humanity's own military history, which she had studied for 10 years before she ever became a xenolinguist because understanding other languages, she had always believed, started with understanding your own species' long ugly story. She thought about every war her own people had fought across 200,000 years of recorded and unrecorded history. The retreats that turned into counterattacks. The sieges that lasted years. The armies that lost battle after battle and still, somehow, did not stop. She picked up her comm and called Grace Okafor. Grace answered on the second ring. She had also not slept much. Nora explained what she had found. Grace listened without interrupting. When Nora finished, Grace was quiet for a moment. Just a moment. "They don't know what we are," Grace said. "No," Nora said. "I don't think they do." Another pause. Then Grace said, "Write it up. Everything. I want it in an hour." Nora wrote it up. Grace read it. Then Grace did something she almost never did, which was to sit back in her chair and look at the ceiling for a while. The Verdani sent their second surrender offer that morning. It was longer than the first one. It included visual documentation of the World Breaker platform's capabilities. It included before and after images of a planet it had previously cracked, which were not easy to look at. It was, in other words, a serious and credible threat delivered with full professional weight. Earth's reply this time was 3 paragraphs. It did not have a catchy 4-word ending. It was precise and careful and composed by a team of people who had thought very hard about what they were doing. It told the Verdani, in the formal language of galactic diplomacy, what humans had done to each other during the Second and Third World Wars. Not vaguely. Specifically. It described the weapons used, the scale of destruction, the number of cities that had stopped existing, the number of people who had not survived. It described how long the wars lasted and what had been left afterward and what had been rebuilt from that. Then it said, in the last paragraph, that humanity had survived all of that, and that it suggested the Verdani take that into account before drawing conclusions about what a World Breaker platform was going to accomplish. Uxral read the reply. His communications officer offered to summarize it. He held up a hand and read it himself, all the way through, which took longer because he stopped several times. When he finished he sat quietly for a long time. Long enough that his tactical officer eventually asked, carefully, if he was all right. "I'm thinking," Uxral said. He was. For the first time since the declaration of war had been sent, he was genuinely thinking about the possibility that the simulations had been wrong. Not about the numbers still favored the Verdani enormously. But numbers assumed the other side was playing the same game, with the same goal, using the same logic. He opened his personal log. Wrote one sentence. Closed it. The sentence was, "I do not think they care how long this takes." Across the galaxy, 11 other species were watching through long-range instruments. They had been watching since the world breaker arrived. Most of them had standing bets, quiet, private, the kind of thing you didn't advertise, on how long Earth had left. Those bets had made sense 3 weeks ago. They were making less sense now. Nobody was updating their bets. Everyone was watching. In a staging bay on the far side of the moon, Sergeant Calvin Pruitt received his deployment orders. He was sitting on a cot eating a protein bar that had the texture of a ceiling tile and the flavor of mild regret. He picked up the orders, read them once, then read them again. 8 soldiers. 1 Verdani supply station. 3 hours to cut the fuel line feeding the world breaker platform before it got into firing range of Earth. He set the orders down. Finished the protein bar. Looked around the staging bay at the 7 people who were going in with him, people he had worked with for 2 years, people he knew the way you know someone when you've been in bad situations together and come out the other side. He picked up his pack and started checking his gear. He did not give a speech. Calvin Pruitt did not give speeches. He just started packing with the calm, deliberate energy of someone who had already done the math and had already decided they liked the odds well enough. Somewhere behind him, the world breaker waited. It had never been stopped before. It had also never been up against anyone who packed a bag like that. #congratulations, you've just declared war on the deadliest species in the galaxy. The insertion went wrong in the first 4 minutes. Calvin Pruitt had known it was going to. Not because he had bad instincts, his instincts were the opposite of bad, which was why he was still alive at 34 after a career that had not been easy on people with bad instincts. He had known it because the map was 3 weeks old and 3 weeks, in an active military operation, was enough time for everything on a map to become a polite suggestion rather than a fact. The drop pod hit the service corridor on the station's lower level right on target. That part worked. The 8 of them came out moving, Calvin first, because he was always first, and they got 12 steps into the corridor before Danny, not Corso, a different Danny, Corporal Danny Osei who was on point, held up a fist and they all stopped. Voices ahead. Verdani. More than the map said should be there. Much more. Calvin came up beside Osei and listened. Counted. The security rotation on the map had 2 guards on this level. The voices suggested at least 6, possibly 8, in a pattern that didn't match anything in the briefing documents. He looked at the corridor ahead. Looked at the schematic on his wrist display. Looked back at Osei. Different door, he said. That was all. 2 words. His team moved. They went up 2 levels through a maintenance shaft that smelled like the Verdani equivalent of machine oil, which was not pleasant, and came out in a junction that technically was not on their route but was 1 corridor over from where they needed to be. Calvin recalculated on the move. The mission had 3 objectives: reach the fuel distribution node, disable the primary transfer relay, and get out before anyone noticed what had happened. The node location hadn't changed. Just the path to it. The new path was less clean. That was fine. Clean was a luxury. Kate Sims was the team's medic, 22 years old, grew up outside Phoenix, had joined the service 3 years ago and had spent most of that time in field medicine rotations and 2 deployments that had been bad enough to give her a very clear sense of what bad actually looked like. She moved through the maintenance shaft without making noise, which was harder than it sounded in full gear, and when they came out in the new junction she immediately found the nearest shadow and put her back to the wall. She was good. Calvin had worked with a lot of medics. She was genuinely good, which was the kind of thing you noticed and didn't say because saying it was unnecessary and they both had things to do. They made it to the first checkpoint, a security door between them and the distribution corridor, without contact. Calvin got it open in 90 seconds using a bypass method that was not in the official manual because it was the kind of thing you learned from someone who had learned it from someone else, passed down through a chain of practical necessity that had nothing to do with official manuals. They were through. Moving. 3 corridors from the node. Then a patrol rotation came around a corner 30 meters ahead of them. Not on the map. Nothing on the map had been right for the past 20 minutes, which Calvin had decided to accept as the operating reality rather than spend time being frustrated about. The team pressed into doorways. Moved backward. Split at Calvin's hand signal, 3 going left, 4 going right, creating a gap in the corridor that the patrol walked through without seeing anything, because humans are small and quiet when they need to be, in the Verdani, who had not expected anyone to be inside their station, were not looking at doorways. Calvin let out a slow breath. They moved again. The node room was behind a secondary access panel at the end of a service corridor that smelled even worse than the maintenance shaft. Calvin got the panel open. Osei went in first, confirmed clear, and they filed in one by one. The node was exactly where the map said it would be, which was a relief, because if the map had been wrong about one more thing, Calvin would have filed a very pointed report about the intelligence division when he got back. The primary relay was a large component, roughly the size of a cargo container, humming steadily, feeding fuel from the station's reserves along the supply line that ran out to the Worldbreaker platform sitting 200,000 kilometers away. Without this relay, the platform's fuel transfer would stop. The platform would run on reserves. The reserves, according to the intelligence briefing, would last approximately 4 hours. 4 hours for the Iron Patience and the rest of Earth's fleet to do something about a 2-kilometer siege weapon sitting in the solar system. Calvin looked at his demolition specialist, a woman named Rosa Fuentes, who had been extraordinarily quiet for the past hour in the way that very focused people are quiet. He nodded at the relay. Rosa got to work. She needed 12 minutes. She had worked on similar hardware before, not Verdani, but close enough in basic engineering logic that the differences were manageable. She moved through it steadily, making precise adjustments, not rushing, because rushing was how people made mistakes, and mistakes in a room with this much stored energy had consequences nobody wanted to experience. Calvin stood at the door and listened. 9 minutes in, he heard something he didn't like. Footsteps. Deliberate. Coming from the direction they hadn't come from, which meant a direction they hadn't mapped, which meant something had changed in the station's security pattern since 3 weeks ago and was changing right now while Rosa had 4 minutes left on the relay. He pulled the door partially shut and positioned Osei and 2 others in the corridor, then went back to the node room and told Rosa without raising his voice, 4 minutes. However it gets done. Rosa did not look up. 3, she said. She got it done in 3. They were moving back through the access panel when the Verdani security element, 6 of them, not on any map, moving fast, came into the far end of the service corridor. Calvin's team went the other way. Fast and quiet, back the way they'd come, route already changing in Calvin's head as they moved. They lost the route to their extraction point. It was behind the security element now. Calvin pulled up the schematic, found a secondary exit 3 levels up that would add 15 minutes and go through a part of the station where the map was, at this point, basically a work of speculative fiction. Up, he said. They went up. 12 minutes later, in a corridor on level 4 that the map insisted was a storage bay, Kate Sims went around a corner and ran directly into a Verdani soldier who was apparently doing something unrelated to the security alert that had now started sounding somewhere below them. The soldier was large. Kate was not large. She had a medical pack, a sidearm she had not drawn because drawing it would have been slower, and a fire extinguisher that was bolted to the wall directly to her left. She unbolted the fire extinguisher. The Verdani soldier was not conscious 30 seconds later. The official after-action report listed him as incapacitated in close contact. Kate did not elaborate. Calvin read the report and did not ask her to. They made extraction with all 8 people. The extraction took 6 hours instead of 3. When they came through the door of the retrieval shuttle, the first thing Calvin did was count. 1, 2, 3. All the way to 8. 8. He sat down on the floor of the shuttle and did not say anything for a while. On the Iron Patience, 200,000 kilometers away, Lou Hartley was watching the sensor feed from the Worldbreaker platform. For 3 hours, the platform had been sitting, powered, tracking, its enormous fuel transfer systems running steadily. Then the tracking data changed. Power outputs on the platform's weapons array started dropping. The transfer relay data went dark. Lou watched the numbers fall on his display. Sat with it for a moment. There it is, he said. He did not smile. He turned to his navigation officer and told her to get the fleet into position. Across the solar system, in the Verdani fleet, Uxral received the report from the station. He read it twice. The relay was gone. The World Breaker had reserves, but reserves were not a resupply line, and without a resupply line the platform was on a clock. More than that, a platform without active fuel transfer was a platform that could not maintain its attack posture indefinitely. It would have to fire now or it would have to retreat. And if it retreated as a target. A large, slow, expensive target. Uxral opened his personal log. He did not write anything for a long time. Then he wrote, 8 soldiers. They sent 8 soldiers and they turned off our weapon. He closed the log. He did not open it again that day. Back in the retrieval shuttle, Calvin Pruitt leaned his head against the wall and closed his eyes. The shuttle hummed around him. His team was quiet, the specific quiet of people who had just been through something and were still processing it, still running through the last 6 hours in their heads looking for the moments where it could have gone differently. It had not gone differently. That was the thing about a plan that survived contact. You still had to survive contact first. The plan was never the guarantee. The people were the guarantee, and only barely, and only if they kept moving and kept thinking and kept finding the next door when the first one was wrong. They had found the doors. They were all going home. That sentence sat in Calvin Pruitt's chest, heavy and quiet and real, and he let it sit there for the whole long ride back. #Congratulations, you've just declared war on the deadliest species in the galaxy. The armistice request came in at 6:18 in the morning, Earth Standard Time. It was formal, correctly structured, and filed under the appropriate section of Galactic Covenant law, which was either an act of dignity or a remarkable amount of nerve, depending on who was reading it. The Verdani Collective, after 7 months and 11 days, after 81 ships and a disabled World Breaker and a resupply station that 8 people had walked into and quietly disassembled, was requesting a ceasefire and talks. Grace Okafor read the request at her desk. She had been awake since 5. She set the document down, picked up her coffee, and looked out the window at the city below, which was doing what cities do in the early morning, waking up slowly, lights coming on, people moving through streets that were still mostly quiet. She thought about the 4 ships from the first engagement. About every name she had read aloud in that broadcast, and the ones that had come after, because there had been more engagements after the first one. 7 months of them. She knew every name. She had made a point of that. She picked up her comm and called Ambassador Carol Finch. Carol Finch was already awake. She had been awake for 2 hours. She had also already read the request. It had gone to her office at the same time it went to Grace's, and she had spent those 2 hours doing what she did when something significant landed on her desk, which was to read everything she had, think about it carefully, and say very little to anyone. "I've been waiting for this," Carol said, when she picked up. "I know," Grace said. "How long do you need to prepare?" "I've been preparing for 4 months," Carol said. "I'm ready when you tell me to go." Grace told her to go. Carol Finch was 51 years old. She had spent the last 20 years in diplomatic service, not the ceremonial kind, not the ribbon-cutting and speech-giving kind, but the other kind, the kind where you sat across a table from someone who did not want to give you anything and you stayed there, patient and quiet and completely immovable, until they did. She had a face that was easy to underestimate, which she had spent 20 years being thankful for. She spoke 4 Earth languages and had spent the past 4 months learning the structural logic of Verdani formal communication well enough to understand every implication underneath their phrasing. She had also read every record of every conquest the Verdani had ever undertaken. All 47 of them. Every surrender document. Every territorial agreement. Every clause, every precedent, every concession that 47 different species had made because they had no choice and no leverage. Carol had leverage. She had built it quietly, piece by piece, over 4 months, while the military kept the Verdani busy. The summit was held on neutral Station Polis, a diplomatic platform orbiting a star that belonged to neither side, operated by a coalition of species who functioned, in galactic political terms, as referees. 11 species had observer status. They were not there to participate. They were there to watch and to record, because what was decided at this table would set a precedent, and everyone in the galaxy understood that precedents were, in the long run, more powerful than any fleet. Uxral sat across the table from Carol Finch on the first day and studied her. He had read her file. He knew she was a diplomat. He knew Earth had chosen to send a diplomat, which meant they believed they were in a strong enough position to end this at a table rather than continue it in space. He was prepared to negotiate from a position of remaining strength. The Verdani still had more ships. They still had more territory. They still had resources that Earth would take decades to match. The World Breaker had retreated, yes, and the opening engagement had been a disaster, yes, but the collective was not broken. They had room to negotiate. They intended to keep several things. Their analysts had prepared a list of acceptable outcomes. Carol opened her bag and put a single folder on the table. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her voice was pleasant and unhurried. "Thank you for the invitation," Uxral said. He was expecting her to start with territory. That was how these talks usually went. Each side staked out a large opening claim and then spent days finding the middle ground. He had a number ready. A position. A concession he was willing to make on the first day to establish goodwill. Carol did not start with territory. She started with trade routes. Specifically, the 3 Verdani trade corridors that ran through regions of space they had claimed but that intersected with human deep space survey paths that had been established before the declaration of war. She had the survey dates. She had the Galactic Covenant articles that governed prior claim. She set the documentation on the table between them and explained, in polite and careful language, that under existing galactic law those corridors were in a legally contested status, and that Earth was filing a formal claim. Uxral looked at the documentation. Looked at his legal advisor, who was reading it. His legal advisor did not look back at him. They spent the first day on the trade corridors. Carol did not raise her voice once. She also did not give back a single corridor. Day 2 was technology patents. The Verdani had used, during the conflict, a scanning system that operated on a frequency range that human scientists had independently developed and formally registered with the Galactic Patent Authority 11 years ago. Carol had the registration. She had the Verdani usage logs. She set them on the table and explained what that meant in terms of compensation. Uxral's legal advisor asked for a recess. They took a 3-hour recess. When they came back, Carol was sitting at the table with a fresh glass of water and the same pleasant expression she had come in with. She had not moved. Day 3 was territorial corridors, specifically, the system buffer zones the Verdani had established around 3-star systems adjacent to human space. Carol had astronomical data going back 40 years showing human survey activity in those buffer zones before Verdani presence was established. She had the dates. She had the records. She had the Galactic Covenant articles that applied to survey-based claim. Uxral said, at the end of day 3, in a voice that was attempting to remain professional, "You cannot possibly want all of this." Carol looked at him. She was quiet for a moment. Not because she was thinking about it. Because she had thought about it for 4 months and the answer was already there and she was deciding how to say it. "We want all of this," she said. "And the precedent." A pause. "You declared war on us. We're just finishing the paperwork." That sentence sat in the room for a long time. The 11 observer species, watching through the station's observation windows and through remote feeds, were very still. In the past decade they had watched the Verdani complete 47 conquests. They had watched 47 species sit across a table from Verdani diplomats and negotiate from no leverage at all, giving back what they had to give because they had already lost. They had seen this table before. They had not seen this version of it. Day 4 was reparations. Carol set the numbers on the table. They were not small numbers. They were, in fact, the largest reparations claim ever filed in galactic diplomatic history, and Carol had documentation for every single line of it, going back to the first transmission cost of receiving the original 63-page declaration. Uxral signed the treaty at the end of day 4. He did not look like someone who had been beaten. He looked like someone who had spent 4 days watching a very careful person take apart something he had built, piece by piece, setting each part aside with gentle precision, until there was nothing left on his side of the table but the pen and the document. He signed. His seal went on the page. Carol Finch closed her folder. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was the same temperature it had been on day 1. On Earth, Grace Okafor received the final treaty terms at 11:47 p.m. She read them. All of them. She picked up her pen, signed her name on the ratification document, and set the pen down parallel to the document's edge, very precisely, very straight. She sat there for a moment looking at the signed page. Then she turned off the lamp on her desk and went home for the first time in 3 days. On the iron Patience, now docked properly and finally, completely, finished with its refit, Lou Hartley was in the mess hall watching the summit proceedings on the wall screen above the coffee machine. He was eating something from a can that had been labeled beef stew in a way that raised questions about the labeling process. Danny Corso was sitting across from him, eating the same thing, watching the same screen. The treaty ratification scrolled across the bottom of the feed. 7 months, 11 days. Full Verdani withdrawal. Territorial concessions. Reparations. A precedent clause that made any future Verdani aggression toward Earth a violation of 11 other species treaty obligations. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then Danny said, "You think they knew what they were getting into?" Lou took a bite of the thing that was probably beef stew. "Nope," he said. Danny nodded slowly. "That's on them." "That's on them," Lou agreed. They watched the feed for another minute. Then Lou finished his stew, set the can down, and stood up. He had a maintenance report due in the morning and 2 crew members who needed their performance evaluations filed before the end of the week. The war was over. There was still work to do. That was the thing about humans. The thing that the Verdani had never modeled and never understood until it was too late to matter. There was always more work to do, and they always showed up to do it. Across the galaxy, in his office on the Verdani flagship, now redirected away from human space, Uxral opened his personal log for the last time in the campaign. He had written in it every day since the first engagement. He had watched his certainty erode, line by line, entry by entry, replaced by something he did not have an exact word for. He wrote, "We sent them a courtesy notice. They sent back a civilization. I do not think we understood, until the very end, that for them, this was not even a close call. It was an inconvenience. A very expensive, very painful inconvenience. I will write 'Do not provoke humans' in every briefing document I author for the rest of my career. I do not think anyone will listen. They never do, before they try." He closed the log. He looked at his display, at the navigational data showing the fleet's new heading, moving away from human space at maximum safe speed. He did not open the log again.